When the Imperial Japanese Navy challenged the aviation industry in 1937 to create a fighter that could outclass everything in the sky, the result was the Zero. When it appeared over China, reports of its performance seemed exaggerated, with impossible agility, unmatched range, and a kill ratio that defied belief. The majority of U.S. experts believed it to be propaganda, but by early 1942 they didn't. Early Allied fighters struggled to compete. More than just a fighter, it represented Japan's early supremacy in the Pacific, but a chance discovery would expose its fatal flaws. In October 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a requirement for a carrier-based fighter that incorporated lessons learned from their ongoing conflict in China. Minimum requirements for the new aircraft would include high maneuverability, a maximum speed of at least 310 miles per hour, and an endurance of 8 hours. Armament was to include two 20-millimeter cannons and two machine guns. Preliminary designs were initiated by the two largest aerospace companies in Japan, Nakajima and Mitsubishi. Within a few months, Nakajima's team pulled out of the competition, claiming that the requirements were unattainable given the current state of aerial technology. Jiro Horikoshi, chief designer at Mitsubishi, believed that the requirements could be achieved if the aircraft was made as light as possible. Due to the design's emphasis on weight reduction, the new aircraft would not include non-essential heavy items like self-sealing fuel tanks or armor protection. Although the Nakajima Sakai 12 engine with 940 horsepower was not as powerful as the latest Western designs, it still had an impressive power-to-weight ratio. On April 1, 1939, the first prototype took to the air, and by January 1940, the first production version came off the assembly line. Eager to see how the fighter would perform under combat conditions, the Navy had 15 shipped to China even before they had completed testing. Its first baptism of fire took place on September 13, 1940, when 34 Soviet-built fighters intercepted 13 Zeros escorting bombers on a raid to Chongqing. Although Zero pilots' claims of 27 shot down for no losses appear unlikely, Chinese records showed 10 pilots killed and another 8 injured, implying a minimum of 18 downed aircraft. Over the next few weeks, it became clear that the Zero completely outclassed all other fighters, and Chinese pilots were instructed to avoid engaging it in combat if at all possible. Details of the Zero's incredible performance slowly filtered back across the Pacific to the United States, where military officials cast doubt on the reports, believing the Japanese were incapable of producing such an aircraft. By the outbreak of war in December 1941, 521 Zeros were operational in the Pacific, where they would compete with aircraft from the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands for air superiority. The best fighter the RAF had in the region was the Hawker Hurricane, while the Dutch used the Brewster Buffalo. The U.S. Army primarily used the Curtiss P-40E Warhawk across its Pacific bases, while the Navy relied on the Grumman Wildcat. The P-40E was the newest and best performing of these four Allied aircraft. Despite the additional weight of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, the Allison V-12 liquid-cooled engine produced 300 more horsepower than the Zero, giving it a slight speed advantage. Furthermore, its 650 caliber machine guns provided significantly more firepower, while its heavier weight increased dive speed, roll rate, and structural strength. Given these advantages, the U.S. was surprised by how poorly the P-40 performed against the Zero in early 1942. In the Philippines, 4 out of 5 fighter squadrons were in the air when the Japanese attacked, in contrast to Pearl Harbor, where only 8 fighters got airborne. Even so, of the 91 operational P-40 fighters that were available in the Philippines on December 8th, only 22 were still operational just 3 days later. Shocked by the scale of the losses, the remaining P-40s were ordered to avoid contact with Zeros and instead assigned to reconnaissance and ground attack missions. Even though U.S. intelligence had been alerted to the Zero's capabilities prior to the start of the war, it wasn't until Allied forces had actually faced it in combat that its effectiveness became evident. The Dutch East Indies and British Indian Ocean theaters were equally disastrous, as the Zero gained complete air dominance in the Pacific. When U.S. Navy pilots first encountered the Zeros in significant numbers during the Battle of the Coral Sea, They were shocked by how easily the Wildcat could be outclimbed and outmaneuvered. The Wildcat's self-sealing fuel tanks and heavy armor kept the Zero from achieving complete dominance in early naval battles. The U.S. was fortunate to have a nearly intact Zero fall into their lap as they sought to unravel the Zero's strengths and weaknesses. When the Japanese attacked Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands in June 1942, one of the Zeros involved in the raid was hit by ground fire and immediately began trailing oil. Petty Officer Koga flew to Akutan Island, 25 miles east of Dutch Harbor, and made an emergency landing on a flat, grassy patch of land. Unfortunately for Koga, what appeared to be solid ground from the air was actually muddy bogland. As it touched down, Koga's landing gear became lodged in the tundra, turning the plane over and bringing it to a violent stop. Koga was killed instantly upon impact, even though the plane was largely intact after the crash. A month later, the wreck was spotted by a Catalina reconnaissance plane, and a salvage crew was dispatched from Dutch Harbor to retrieve it. The team was able to extract the Zero from the mud, transport it overland to a nearby barge, and transport it to Dutch Harbor for packing before shipping it to San Diego Naval Air Station for testing. The Zero had been delivered and repaired by the end of September 1942 so that it could be analyzed and tested against the newest U.S. fighters soon to go into service. Although the tests conducted on the captured Zero did not impact the design of new U.S. aircraft, they did provide insight into the handling characteristics of the Zero and the most effective ways to defeat it. They discovered that the Zero had a remarkably tight turning circle, which meant that with enough twists and turns, the Zero would eventually end up on the tail of any Allied fighter in a dogfight. They came to the conclusion that an approach known as the high side gun pass, or as pilots like to refer to it, boom and zoom, was the most effective tactic to defeat the Zero rather than engage it in a dogfight. This required the pilot to gain an altitude advantage in order to perform a powered dive towards his opponent, allowing him to swoop down and blast away in a single high-speed pass. In order to recover the potential energy of a height advantage, the attacker climbs back to a safe altitude using the extra kinetic energy produced by gravity. This allows the attacker to launch another attack and dive again, effectively depriving the Zero of its most valuable asset, maneuverability. Given the Zero's lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, a brief burst of fire was usually sufficient to destroy it. Koga's Zero provided invaluable knowledge that was used to train thousands of new pilots for the rapidly expanding Army and Navy air services. The test results were consistent with the conclusions of many U.S. pilots already in combat, including Claire Chennault and Jimmy Thack, who had already developed fighter tactics to deal with the Zero. By employing these strategies, the Zero's combat effectiveness was reduced, and Allied pilots were able to cope with their aircraft's performance shortcomings in comparison to the Zero. Two factors came together to drastically alter the situation by the end of 1943. By this point, the majority of U.S. aircraft in service were new, advanced, high-powered designs, and Japanese pilot quality had significantly deteriorated. New aircraft entering service in the United States were powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, which had roughly twice the horsepower output of the Zero engines, making the Corsair, Thunderbolt, and most importantly, Hellcat significantly faster than the Zero. Although these newer fighters had a tactical advantage, the Zero, in the hands of a highly skilled pilot, could still challenge for air dominance. In June 1944, the largest carrier versus carrier engagement in history, involving 24 aircraft carriers, would take place. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, as it was known in Japan, would determine who would gain air superiority in the Pacific. Following 2 days of combat in which Zeros and Hellcats fought for supremacy in the air, the U.S. lost slightly more than 100 aircraft, while the Japanese lost over 500. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was a disaster from which it would never recover after losing almost all of its carrier air force. The battle became known in the United States as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because of the wildly disproportionate loss ratio that American pilots inflicted on Japanese aircraft. The Hellcat, designed with heavy armor, powerful engines, and self-sealing fuel tanks, proved to be very forgiving of mistakes and was able to withstand significant damage while still getting its pilot home safely. However, if the Zero were to receive a single shot into its fuel tank, it might lack enough fuel to get back to base. Not only was it unforgiving of mistakes in combat, but taking full advantage of the Zero's high maneuverability necessitated complex acrobatic maneuvers. The Zero's tactical effectiveness was thus heavily dependent upon pilot skill. Aviation fuel shortages caused trainees to receive increasingly less flight time training prior to combat deployment, which led to a high number of casualties that the Japanese pilot training program was unable to adequately replace. With its performance advantage gone, the once mighty Zero had become a death trap for almost all but a few of Japan's most skilled pilots still alive. 4 months after the Marianas Turkey shoot at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the IJN did not even attempt to challenge U.S. air dominance, instead using its remaining carrier force as bait to lure Halsey away from the invasion beaches so that its battleships could attempt to destroy the invasion force. By the last year of the war, the Zero's design limitations had long since been reached, and it had failed to keep pace with the rapid advancements in Allied aviation technology. Desperation led to the Zero's role in kamikaze missions, where the aircraft, once the pride of Japanese air power, was used as a type of long-range anti-ship guided missile in suicide attacks. This shift highlighted the Zero's obsolescence, as it could no longer operate effectively in conventional combat. There are more great videos on my channel page. Check it out and press that bell icon so you don't miss the next video.